Education policy, especially higher education policy, is a lot more important than higher education policy. It's become a core issue in the American social contract, and as we see in our meetings in Salzburg, it's a core issue in the social contract in other nations as well. There's an old role that education played for a long time, where societies, most of us, who a long time ago at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution had to figure out how we could reconcile capitalism and democracy. Democracy said that we're all equal in some sense. Capitalism pretty much ensured that we're going to be unequal in an economic sense because of our work effort, the families we're born into, our innate ability, luck. And because capitalism has to accumulate capital somewhere, it has to be unequal in order to spur investment. And democracy says we're equal. The old resolution to that was that government would become the banker for capitalism, take money out of the system, the wealth, the stupendous wealth that capitalism created, and reinvest it back in the citizenry, either providing direct services like healthcare or providing people with food, but also by investing in education. In the old days, investing in education meant something like liberal arts education. In the 19th century, the reason we guaranteed that people could go to school was not so they could get a job. It was because they could read and write and then, in a sense, participate fully in a democracy, participate fully in the life of their times. Since then, since the Industrial Revolution took on much more momentum, and especially since 1983 in the modern world, after the 80-81 recession, your education pretty much determines, in your access to post-secondary education and training, pretty much determines whether or not you're going to be in the middle class. So education got in cahoots with capitalism. So now it's crucial that we fund education in order to maintain some balance between our two core institutions, capitalism and democracy, and one, general education, liberal education, in order to allow us to participate fully in our times, to understand what we read in the paper, participate in the government, to be good citizens, to develop ourselves to our full potential, but also to get a job, because in a capitalist society, if you don't get a job, you really aren't fully participating in your time. And even though this makes educators uncomfortable, what I would say to them is this. Education has crucial cultural, political, and individual development goals. But if you don't make people employable, if you don't give somebody the skills required to get work and keep work, it's very unlikely that they're going to further develop themselves, participate fully in the politics of their day, be contributing members in a family, in the formation of a family. So education, the economic role of education, I think while it isn't the only role, I think it's become the pivotal one. And if you don't fulfill your economic mission to make people employable, you won't fulfill all your other missions either. It is, in our time, in the last several years especially, as deficits mount, it has become, in many people's minds, a settled issue that we're going to have to cut back dramatically on public services. And I think to some extent that is unavoidable. But I would argue that among all the public functions that we do in fact pay for, education in social and economic terms is the crucial one. It really is the balance point, the intermediary between the demands of our economy and the demands of our democratic culture. So my first response to that is we need to come up with the money. I also suspect that we're going to have to make the system more efficient, because if we're going to fund Medicare and Social Security and other and defense and other kinds of public functions, we're going to have to use our higher education money more effectively. So I think efficiency matters. I think it is important that we know what the outcomes of education are, that we measure learning. And even more to the point, I think, we've come to a point where we need to find out the extent to which particular curriculums, particular majors, particular certificates, particular programs leverage employment for people, because in a system where people are paying for their education more and more on loans, we need to be sure that the education provides enough income so that they can pay back their loans and refill the public bucket so somebody can get the next loan. So we've got to be a bit more economic in our thinking about how we use education resources. There is an easy way to do that, which is simply to measure the wages people get as they move through post-secondary institutions, to tell them before they go or while they're going that if you major in engineering, you'll make $85,000 a year for 45 years doing engineering every day after you eat your breakfast for most of the rest of your life. And if you major in arts and humanities, you'll make about $42,000 a year by doing things you love to do every day after breakfast for the rest of your life. And in some cases, the programs are not worth the money. That tends to be among sub-baccalaureate degrees and certificates. There, I think we need to very carefully measure whether a certificate in cosmetology will make you enough money to justify the cost, as opposed to a certificate in engineering, which we know will make enough money to justify the cost. We're going to have to start making some hard choices here. One of the things that I think is apparent, and has been apparent in the data for some time, is the higher education system keeps improving in quality. Higher education institutions keep trying to get higher and higher quality students, to give them more prestige, to make them more selective. That makes them more saleable to parents and students. So you end up with a dynamic where rich, high-quality institutions are chasing rich, high-test score students, and it's a marriage made in heaven. It happens very fast. As a result of that, the whole higher education system is becoming very carefully stratified by income, by race, and by ethnicity. And what we see is that the white population, which fled the central cities 40 years ago, fleeing towards good schools in the suburbs, good grade schools and high school, well, they finally arrived on campus, and they're all arriving in the top 2 tiers of the education system. And African Americans, Hispanics, low-income kids, and poor kids are all in the 2-year system, almost half the students now, or in the least selective 4-year schools. I don't think we'll have much luck changing selectivity and access, frankly, for the more selective 4-year schools. They are worth the money as well. The real focus here, I think, is a tough moral choice, which is we can't make the whole system fair and equal. It's simply not within reach. There's too much to do. And affirmative action, as we know it, is a small program that affects a few institutions at the top. Where the work needs to be done is not to move low-income, minority, Hispanic, and poor kids to Harvard and to the elite institutions. What we need to do is to move quality education to the 2-year schools and the less selective colleges where they are. And that's a very different policy question. It means moving money, moving resources, moving quality into 2-year institution and the least selective 4-year schools, because that will allow us to make people who haven't had higher education before, it allows us to make them better off. The other choice is to be very idealistic and say we simply won't do that because it's tracking, but then we end up in a very difficult moral position, because by hewing to our own ideals, we don't allow people to become better off. And I think we're at a stage in the mass system of higher education where the issue is moving people up through the system by making them better off.